Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Australia's energy transition is the biggest engineering project this country has ever seen. It's estimated to take decades and cost about $320 billion. And while we've made good early progress, there's a tremendous amount of work to be done, especially if we're to meet our emissions targets. But a recent KPMG study suggests only 1 in 4 Australians have actually heard of the energy transition. It puts the energy industry and the government in a challenging position, investing billions into a transition to greener energy that a lot of people don't actually understand, while meeting the core needs of consumers, i.e. keeping the lights on and delivering predictability in energy prices and bills. EnergyAustralia is one of the nation's biggest energy retailers with 1.6 million customers. Mark Collette is the Managing Director of EnergyAustralia. Mark, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Pleasure to be here, Sean.
You spoke about the energy transition in a speech earlier this year. In it, you said the easy part of the transition, adding wind and solar and keeping the network running, is over. So the easy part's over. What is the big challenge ahead then? What's the next step that's harder than what we've been through?
Sean, as you say, the energy transition is the biggest engineering project the country has ever done. And the first step, the reason I say it was easy, is that we had an existing system that worked. It produced electricity. There was more electricity than we needed. So lots of redundancy in the system. And it was not something that customers or anyone generally had to worry about. And the first part of the transition was actually just using less coal. And the way we did that as a country was to add rooftop solar and wind and solar to the grid. And then during the times when those were generating, then we'd just turn down coal and everything just went on in the background. The step ahead is different because we can no longer just do that in order to reduce emissions and keep the grid working. The first point I'd make around why it's different is that we've reached the point where coal actually needs to be retired. It's not a case of turn down the coal and let something else generate for a while. We're actually retiring coal-fired power stations. And when we retire coal-fired power stations, they were always on and they would turn up and down in response to all the different weather conditions and customer patterns and things like that. And so now, in addition to adding wind and solar, which are available when the weather provides them, Australia needs backup generation in the form of batteries and gas-fired generation and hydro. And adding those to the system is just more things to do at the same time as adding the renewables. And beyond that, the other reason it's hard, the other major reason, is that the easy bits to connect all that wind and solar to the grid have been done. So now, to add more wind and solar, we actually need to build more grid as a country. And so then you look at that and say, okay, the path ahead means building more grid to connect more wind and solar and building more backup generation. And ultimately, that's why it's harder.
Okay, just something there I want to point out. Going backwards isn't an option. You said that in your speech, and it's something that really hit home when I read it. The idea that coal and the grid based on coal is a 20th century product, it's end of life. So it's not like we can just extend it forever. Is that right?
Absolutely, Sean. Case in point, we own the Yallourn coal-fired power station, which is closing on the 30th of June 2028. Yallourn is a fantastic site. It's been generating power for 100 years as of June 15 this year. Thousands of Victorians have supplied millions of Victorians through their work at Yallourn over many, many, many decades. But that power station is 50 years old. And when you go and walk around the power station, it's clear that the end is coming. There's no option just to keep going. So really, the job ahead is to build the new system in time for the old one to close elegantly and in a way where most people don't even notice. Because as you say, Sean, only 1 in 4 people, according to the KPMG study, actually understand that this massive engineering transition is actually going on in the energy sector in Australia.
Okay, so it's going to cost about $320 billion in today's dollars. Who knows what that means going forward? Bigger than AUKUS, I think you've said at some point or other. How do you attract the necessary investment? Because another point you've made is that really we have relied on government to attract the investment. But at the moment, the returns that you're making on renewable projects are around 5 to 7%. Private credit is probably earning you more. If I'm an investor, I'm thinking, where do I get the best return? How do we solve that piece of the puzzle?
Look, it's a major question, Sean, and I'd start with what customers actually want. And that's why the reason I'd start there is that's where the energy transition starts. And looking at what customers want, they absolutely want the electricity to be there when they need it, but they also want it to be predictable. And predictable is not a feature of the current energy system. If you just look at residential bills and how they've changed in recent years, plus 20% 2 years ago, roughly, in terms of price changes, and then flat. That sort of price profile puts customers under a lot of pressure when they're budgeting because they just don't know what's going to happen. So I'd argue that the place to start is to say, well, we want predictable outcomes for bills. And predictable means something akin to what it used to be back in the days when the system was built, which was broadly bills would track inflation. To get to that sort of level, then instead of continuing with the energy market in its current form, the place I'd start with is look at all the investments that need to happen and consider how the market frameworks can change in order to deliver that level of predictability. So, for example, Sean, the federal government has the Capacity Investment Scheme, which is one of those government schemes to drive new energy investments. One of the ways that that can provide predictability is for retailers to be buying the energy and the services that come out of those new projects and then bundling it into a regulatory regime which actually thinks about how the prices will evolve over the next decade, not just over the next year, and does so in a way where there's stability on the retail price, which means stability on the returns for investors at the same time. And I think that's the path by which we can attract that funding, because we all know that infrastructure investors, people who can see predictable returns, they have massive amounts of money to invest, and that's a big opportunity I see for the sector.
Stay with me, Mark. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Managing Director of Energy Australia, Mark Collett. Is there some way we can, rather than having government picking winners, which policy is a little bit like that at the moment, it's kind of almost having the government as a backstop, so we're letting the private sector invest and the returns are somewhat guaranteed by government, and that way you can somehow give life to the green bond market, which is nascent at the moment. I'm just trying to think of creative ways to actually get the super funds in to be spending the $300 billion without actually the government picking winners.
I'm with you there, Sean. The power of the energy markets when they were first launched, because the energy markets were government-created markets, the real power of them was that the government didn't have to use its balance sheet to invest, because it put in place market signals which led people like us to invest in the gas-fired generation, wind and solar and all those things. So the way the industry is thinking about that at the moment, Sean, is that the government is launching a 2030 market review. And I think you could say, well, the industry would like that to be happening really quickly. And the job is to work out what market frameworks could change so that people like us can underwrite those projects with things like green bonds and different forms of equity and debt capital, because the market structures are in place that give confidence to all those investors that they'll get a return. I think that path is even better than the government having to underwrite everything, because it actually activates private capital without needing the government backstop.
Okay, let's talk about gas. You've got the Tallawarra B gas turbine. What role does gas-fired generation play in the energy mix going forward?
2024 has shown exactly the role that gas is going to play. And imagine winter a few months ago. It was very cold across the eastern seaboard. There was no wind. And during those periods, that's when gas stepped in to show what it does. And that's what it does. On those days, it turns on to make the system work during the energy doldrums. That doesn't happen all the time. By definition, it's only happening maybe less than 5% of the year. But that essential service, that essential insurance that's there to back up the system and make everything work, that's the role of gas. That's the ongoing role of gas.
Okay, so gas will be around for quite a while. What about the national electricity market and the grid itself? I think you said 10,000 kilometres of new transmission grid, is that right?
Absolutely. AEMO, the market operator, does a integrated system plan where it sort of does a projection of how the world could turn out according to their least cost modelling. And they're the ones who are saying something like 10,000 kilometres of new grid to connect up all that wind and solar.
Can we do it?
Like all big engineering projects, they are possible, but they're really, really hard. And in order to do it, it involves starting smart. And somewhere like Queensland has been very smart in the way it's just looked at its grid and thought, okay, what are the cheapest ways to enhance the grid near renewable energy zones? And they're starting by going for the low-hanging fruit. Makes a lot of sense. There will be a role for the high-hanging fruit as well, but certainly getting motion through the low-hanging fruit is a good way to start on that problem.
Okay, your words here. The basic problem to solve is to develop a zero-carbon form of energy that can provide weeks' worth of electricity on short notice with effectively no limitation on volume. How far away are we from that? Because what we're talking about is a transition. We need to get to the point where it's zero carbon, it's on demand, we're not worried about shortages, we can get it to places. How far away are we from that?
Look, I'd start with what we do have. And what we do have is we have wind, we have solar, we have gas-fired generation, batteries, pumped hydro. We've got a lot of the pieces, and they can take us. They can make the system work, so they can deliver that reliability, on-demand electricity, and they can take us down to 95% plus reduction in emissions, which is massive. So that last piece, the bit that I talk about, we still need. It's not clear exactly what the best answer will be. Maybe it's sodium batteries, maybe it's green hydrogen. To me, it still looks like it's at least 5 to 10 years away, but that's okay. As long as there are development projects coming along in that time frame, if we can do all the things we can do now through those existing technologies and have enough irons in the fire globally, because there's a global challenge on those emerging technologies, as long as one or two pop out in the next 10 years, we should be okay.
Mark, is it energising being part of the solution to, I think it was Kevin Rudd, wasn't it, saying the great, I can't quite remember the words he used, but the great challenge of this generation is what you're working on. It must be somewhat energising doing that. Pardon the pun.
Absolutely. It's energy. And sometimes I think of myself, and we joke around that I'm the chief energy officer. Pun fully intended on that one, Sean. And that's why people join Energy Australia. They join Energy Australia because we make a difference. Energy is so fundamental to people's lives, and people in Energy Australia are working together to bring this new system to life for the benefit of their friends and family. And we're all absolutely delighted when we make big steps forward, like a Tallawarra B or our Warreen battery, or purchasing the output of a new wind farm and bringing it to life. These are all very big things that give us a lot of sense of satisfaction because we're doing things that matter.
Fantastic, Mark. Thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Pleasure to be here, Sean.
That was Mark Collette, Managing Director of Energy Australia. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.